Now you might have noticed when bouncing we need to have an open track to bounce onto, and seeing with that is just a single track normally, those bounce tracks will inevitably end up being mono. So what happens when you paint yourself into a corner and you've recorded all 4 tracks and you still want to add more parts? Are you out of luck? Nope. If you connect your Portastudio up to an external cassette player, or even better, a DAT recorder if you have one, then you can record the output of all 4 tracks into a stereo mix on that second recorder. Once we have that mix, we can record that back into our Portastudio on tracks 1 and 2, panned hard left and hard right. Then we have 2 more tracks left for more parts. Now, what are the downsides to this? As with any bouncing, we are losing some flexibility at mixdown because we're merging tracks together. We've also gone down 2 generations. One's out to the second recorder here, and then again when we record that back into our Portastudio. Now, we can cut our losses on that second generation loss by actually taking that tape that we've recorded the output of our Portastudio, taking this tape here and make that the new multi-track cassette back in our Portastudio. But there's actually a hole in that argument. In order to do that, we have restricted ourselves to 1 7/8 inches per second tape speed, which normal cassette decks record on. And you will probably lose the benefit of DBX noise reduction, because most cassette decks use Dolby, which is incompatible with your Portastudio. Noise reduction is an encode-decode process. The same type of noise reduction needs to be present both when we record and then when we play back. So see if you can follow this. This is going to be for extra credit, okay? Once I record into a Portastudio, I'm recording with DBX noise reduction. So I am encoding with DBX noise reduction. When we mix this down into a second cassette deck, which is probably going to have Dolby, we then decode as it comes out of this machine. So everything's fine, everything's clean. And then it gets into our second cassette deck, which is going to encode with Dolby. Now, if we were to pull this out, remember the only reason we wanted to do this was to eliminate that second generation loss of recording back, and we're going to try and use this as our new multi-track. Trouble is, this has been encoded with Dolby, and we don't have a Dolby decoder in our Portastudio. Now, this isn't, when I talk about encoding and decoding, this isn't like a James Bond kind of decode where you can't even hear anything on here. You'll be able to hear your recording, but it'll have all sorts of pumping kind of artifacts, and it'll be noisy, and basically all that whole reason that we did this to make a good recording will kind of go out the door. What about, though, kind of so leaving that whole noise reduction thing behind us, what about if there was a way to take these 2 generations, once out to our secondary recorder here, and then back in with little more noise than we would incur with just 1 generation loss? Remember I said that this recorder could be another cassette or a DAT recorder? Here's the thing. DAT recorders have far better recording specs than the cassette format, so that when we record out to a DAT deck and back in, even though it's technically 2 bounces, it only ends up being kind of sounding like 1. Now, I know it's technically 2, don't write me nasty letters. It's just that with proper level setting, what goes into a DAT recorder is virtually indistinguishable with what comes out. So even though we are doing 2 bounces here, the only generation loss we really hear is that second one back into your Portastudio. Please hear me on this one. I know it's not a digital copy across here from the Portastudio to the DAT recorder, but when you record a lower resolution recording into a higher resolution recorder, the effects of that bounce are drastically reduced. I can probably hear a couple of you screaming at the TV right now. Well, great, if I could afford a DAT recorder, I would have bought a DA Series 8-track. I understand that sometimes budgets need to be kept in mind. So how about, in that spirit, if I told you about a recorder that you probably already have just sitting around in your own home, whose recording quality is up towards that of a DAT recorder? The lowly VCR. Who'd have thunk it? That same piece of junk that you record all those Star Trek episodes on is actually a high-quality recorder with awesome dynamic range and a really great frequency response. Now, I'll qualify that by saying that it needs to be obviously a stereo model, and it really needs to have hi-fi tracks. It needs to be a hi-fi VCR. I'm serious. Before DAT recorders were around, I used to master everything I had onto my hi-fi VCR. This one here happens just to be an SVHS model, but any regular VHS model that has hi-fi tracks will do. You'll probably want to get a model that has easy access to the front panel, such as these guys. Just use regular RCA cables for left and right in. One thing to remember is that these hi-fi VCRs allow you to play back either the hi-fi tracks, that's the stereo tracks, or a mono-linear track. You need to look in your manual about how to select the hi-fi tracks. If you're playing back just using the mono-linear track, the results are very, very average. A VCR actually has a very slow tape speed, but the hi-fi VCR tracks, they're the ones to get. Now, any VCR you have at home that has hi-fi tracks should do, but if you're going out to buy one, then there's probably a couple of things you might want to put on your wish list. As we said before, probably front panel access to inputs is a good thing to do. And also, some sort of way to adjust input gain would be good. Otherwise, the VCR will kind of have an auto gain, which sometimes can be kind of a cool compression, sometimes maybe not. And along the same lines, you may want to have input level meters so you can see how hot the signal is. Just mix all 4 tracks of your Portastudio over to the hi-fi VCR and then bounce it back into your Portastudio's tracks 1 and 2. Then pan those tracks 1 and 2, hard left and hard right, and you have 2 extra tracks to continue on with. So we've covered 2 of the 3 ways